Hi everyone, and welcome to In Deep Geek. Welcome to the second in a new series of mine, which is looking at the secrets of the world of Ice and Fire. Last week we looked at Winterfell. We had Joe Buckley on, and he was talking us through what might be lying beneath Winterfell. What might its role be going forward? And today I'm absolutely delighted. I've got one of my favourite people in the A Song of Ice and Fire community here, Amanda. Do you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda, and I do go by Crofu's Daughter. You can find me on Twitter. I do have a YouTube channel. It's called The Disputed Lands, where we have a couple of videos that we're probably going to talk about a little bit today. And I'm just extremely happy to be here.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on. So what we're going to be talking today is Valyria, old Valyria. Now, this is unlike Winterfell, which is clearly still standing. This is something ancient, but it is no more. And so that kind of adds to the mysteries, because we don't know huge amounts about what it was like when it was there. But Amanda, could you just give us just at a basic level, what was Valyria as a city, as a civilization? What's your sort of top lines on this?
So it's sometimes referred to as Old Valyria, which is kind of a misnomer, because we don't actually have a new Valyria. It's basically just Valyria. It's named after the city that the freehold is founded on, and the correct term, I guess, would be the Valyrian freehold, although you will often see it just blankly referred to within the series as Valyria. But it was an ancient city where the Valyrians were said to arise. And it is now completely extinct, because about 400 or 500 years ago, the doom came to Valyria, and the 14 Flames, which were a volcanic little cluster of volcanoes, erupted, and the entire Valyrian peninsula was fragmented in their civilization, as we know it, as far as their culture and a lot of the mysteries and magic and everything that the fandom is really enthralled by is actually gone. And so, yeah, that's what we're going to be discussing today.
And exactly. And so what we've got is this ancient empire. It's kind of like the way we might think of the Roman Empire, as this sort of very civilized but also very cutthroat empire that ruled huge amounts of the known world in its time, but then eventually obviously came to its demise. Let's talk about it while it was still around as an empire. As you say, it was called the Valyrian Freehold. There were seemingly various kind of ranks within this. The top rank, there were 40 dragon riding houses, which were involved in these kind of politics. Then you have other kind of Valyrians. Then you have conquered peoples in some way. Could you tell us a little bit about the Valyrians as a race? What do you think, what makes a Valyrian a Valyrian?
So the Valyrians, they are defined by their features often. They have very, very distinct features that are not seen in any other races throughout the series. And they have incredibly pale skin. They have very pale hair in shades of, silver and gold. And they have the very distinct purple eyes. And from the characters that we've seen within the series, they can kind of range from a light purple to a very dark purple, almost indigo. Some of the other characters throughout history that have been described, you do have Valyrians that have blue eyes as well. And so eyes in shades of purple and blue are some of the features that you're going to find there. Now, as far as the race itself, the Valyrians have what we believe to be the ability of dragon bonding that you're not going to find in any other race throughout the series. It with the exception of nettles, which we may do.
Okay,
we may not.
I was going to say, but we'll go with that.
There may be some exceptions. There may be some exceptions, but and generally, a blanket way of looking at it. In the broad strokes, the Valyrians do possibly possess some sort of bond to dragons that we do not see with other races. So it's shown within the series, within the history of the Targaryens, that they actually did try to, in order to do another thing that's a little bit different than other races. They have a custom of wedding brother to sister. And in order to do that, they actually had declared an edict that the Targaryens, who were Valyrian in descent, were their race was better, for lack of a better term, and that they did not, the rules of the Seven, as far as marriage goes, did not apply to them because they were above that. And so incest, very distinct features, dragon riding, all of those things kind of start to make up what we see of the Valyrian people that kind of set them apart.
Yeah, so they were the people who could in some way bond with or control the dragons in a way that nobody else seemed to be able to. Now, we don't know all of the history. There are sort of legends about, they stumbled across them as where they were like sheep herders and they come, oh, here's some dragons and we can magically bond with them. But we're not 100% sure what's going on there. But it does seem that they got a little bit obsessed by dragons and what I'd like is that, and one of the reasons I've got you on for this is that I know you did a series of videos looking at this idea that they, as a race, they're not purely human. There's some deeper link to the dragons going on. Could you just give us a sort of an overview of what you mean, or what I mean by that?
Right. So, well, it's hinted throughout the series, and throughout the series, throughout the World of Ice and Fire, throughout Fire and Blood, it's hinted at time and time again. And the fandom, and it's not just me, the fandom has been discussing this for years. But Fire and Blood gave a little bit more information that started to kind of put all of the pieces together in a way that provided a pretty cohesive narrative on what's going on. But basically, the premise that I tried to show in the series is the premise of Septon Barth. And if you've watched History of Westeros, they have this video discussing Septon Barth. And one of the things that they really found that I really took home from that is that Septon Barth is always right. He is. He's always right.
Mushroom is always right. Septon Barth is sometimes right.
Well, I mean, I guess you could believe Mushroom above Septon Barth, but no, Septon Barth is pretty right most of the time, and so I kind of took that home and looked at Septon Barth's assumptions on how dragons were created. And it stated in the World Book that he suggests that dragons were created through the mixing of wyvern stock. And later on with Fire and Blood, we get the whole Aerea thing, and it's completely mysterious and macabre and horrible. And what we took from that is that he was inspired to write natural history, which is the full name of it is Dragons, Worms, and Wyverns. They're on natural history. It was that instance that inspired him to write it. Now, and this is something that's been discussed in the forums way before Fire and Blood, but there's been heavy speculation throughout the fandom that the mixing of wyvern stock, it probably included fireworm stock, and it's because we see with Aerea and the Kindly Man, their discussion, the Kindly Man suggests that fireworms are related to dragons. It said that, for they breathe fire too, except they bore through stone and soil. So what the fandom kind of took to is kind of putting two and two together. When you look at the actual name of the book, it's called Dragons, Worms, and Wyverns. They're in natural history. it's pretty easy to kind of put 2 and 2 together and figure out that Barth probably suggested a mixing of both the wyvern and the fireworm. And so, and did you want to, I'm just talking, is there anything that you wanted to add in real quick? Because I could just keep going.
Well, no, I mean, I'd love you to carry on for a little while longer. So I think one thing that I would just sort of say is that the Valyrians seem to have been obsessed with mixing together different types of animals and creatures and all the rest of it. And so you see a lot of the kind of the sphinxes and hybrid creatures that seems to come, that we see across Essos, that seems to come from the Valyrian culture. This idea that you add different creatures together to create another creature. And that, I think, hints at what you're saying as well, that this was what they did, some kind of genetic breeding with one creature and another creature. Now, what you're saying is that dragons just now was that dragons were created by them, if I'm hearing you right. They were created by the Valyrians by doing this kind of like cross-breeding. But the other element to this is the idea that the Valyrians themselves, the Targaryens, we hear them talk about it again and again, particularly people like Viserys, and you say blood of the dragon and all the rest of it.
Yes.
Is there a hint here that this might have been taken to the next level, and Valyrians might also somehow be linked in with dragons?
Yes. So in my video, we discuss Septim Barth and we discuss his hypothesis. And what I do is I do my best to show all the ways throughout the series that this mixing has been hinted at. And then we discuss the other dragon origin stories. And one of them, it actually comes from the Valyrians themselves. And the Valyrians claim that they possess the blood of the dragon. And when you, knowing that there was already experimentation, blood experimentation with hybridization, if you believe Barth to be true, then the claims of the Valyrians possessing the blood of the dragons, there may be some weight to that. I mean, it's been heavily implied and heavily hinted at. So what I did then is I did an exploration of all those Targaryen deformities. And of course, the most striking one, that we know about is, of course, Daenerys and her baby Rhaego. And it's said that he was blind, and he had, a stub of a scale of a tail and rudimentary wings. And he had very dragon-like deformities. And, this is one of the things that first kind of set the fandom ablaze, like right from the get-go, was that. And then you hear tales of this again and again and again, especially with Maegor. And he had several children that were deformed, and many were eyeless, many were, had scales, or, had both genitalia. One of them actually had no limbs, so he was one of his babies was limbless. So you see all these different things, and of course Rhaenyra, she had another baby that was scaled and had a stubby tail, and you see all of these deformities, and you start to kind of believe these tales. And so what I did is I took what we knew from Barth's supposition of the crossing of the fireworm and the wyvern. And we see the wyvern deformities. We see that genetic, we see those genetic possibilities within those deformities, or, you can call them dragon deformities. But the ones that are kind of confusing are like the limbless features, the eyeless features, and that's, something that kind of caused some confusion within the fandom until you took a look at Fire and Blood. And in Fire and Blood, you see a smoking gun. And that smoking gun is Aerea Targaryen's hatchling. Aerea Targaryen's dragon hatched, and it was white and blind and eyeless. And it was just a complete monstrosity. And so what I took from that is that we may actually that dragon actually came out kind of like a worm. And what's interesting is that the worm is eyeless and white. And fireworms are said to be completely subterranean creatures. And one of the things that we always see with, is very, very common with subterranean, creatures that's in George's world is, of course, blind and white features. We see those in the caves. We see them in Bloodraven's cave. We have white and eyeless fish. It's spoken about how Ashai is clothed in shadow and never sees the sun, and they have eyeless fish. And then you see this in an Aerea sample chapter in a cave. You have these blind and eyeless fish. And in George's other works, he has worms, and they are completely subterranean, and they are white and eyeless. So if you take what George has already put into his world and what he's already written about in the past, the possibility of fireworms having those same white and eyeless features that showed up in Aerea Targaryen's hatchling starts to become a possibility, because it's also something that we see in our own real world. So then you look at the eyeless deformities in baby Rhaego. You see the eyeless deformities seen in Maegor's children. You see those, and you start to kind of put everything together, and you say, oh, those are the features of this experimentation. Basically, what we're getting is just those features that had decided to express themselves. Their genes weren't turned off, or they just kind of were born like that. They were born wrong.
Absolutely. But, I think this is fantastic. I think it's an absolute slam dunk. I think we know now on the basis of this, what seems to have happened is that the Valyrians made dragons in the sense of they took a couple of things that were quite dragon-like and then sort of turned them into dragons. And then they made sure that they had a special bond with these dragons. Dragons obviously being massively game-changing to how they can take over the world. They made sure that they could bond with dragons by kind of gene splicing, in our kind of modern way of saying it, a little bit of dragon blood into themselves, which is why we get with the Valyrians when we say this kind of like heat resistance. They're not immune to fire or anything like that, but they do clearly have some sort of heat resistance. They do have some sort of resistance to some human-like diseases and things like that. So there are a whole load of things that make you just go, oh, well, and they love fire. As just another thing. So there's lots of things that you go, so there's clearly, I think, a link across here. So thank you. That was a fantastic kind of walk through what seems to have been going on. So we have this race, the Valyrians, who had this empire. They used their dragons. They've conquered most of the known world, being most of Essos. But then something happened. Then we had this huge cataclysm. You talked about it before, the doom of Valyria. Now, this is the end of it all. The upshot of it seems to have been that only one dragon-riding family survived. George R.R. Martin's been very clear about. Yes, there were a couple of little things. There was definitely a couple of dragon riders that were in lease at the time. There was another one who decided, bizarrely, to go back in and see what was going on. But the only ones who actually survived were the Targaryens. I think the big question here, I've got my theory, which I will happily set out in a moment. I would love to hear your theory, because everyone's got a theory on what happened. Why did Valyria blow up?
Okay, so, now, first off, is your theory that the Targaryens had something to do with the Valyria?
No.
Okay.
I'm very happy to do my theory first, if you like.
Okay, go ahead.
So my theory, and I did a video on this a couple of years ago. So if you want the longer version, feel free to go and hunt for it. It was called something like "What Caused the Doom of Valyria. But for me, the killer factor, I think the Faceless Men, when talking to the kindly man, he clearly seems to hint that it was they who did it. And when we say did it, yes, there's these 14 flames. Basically, there are volcanoes under where Valyria was, and they were being kept in check by fire magicians. So in order to blow up Valyria, you had to kill these fire magicians. And it makes sense that these kind of the proto version of the Faceless Men did it. Now, I know a lot of people seem to think this is because they were slaves and therefore they felt that they deserved it. But the kindly man is very, very, very clear with Aerea. It's not about whether someone deserves it. It's about all men must die. So this isn't just a grudge. Now, my take is that, okay, there's this, there was at the time this, it was a sort of a prophecy in Valyria that the doom of Valyria was going to be caused by Lannister gold. Now, this I find a fascinating kind of little bit of prophecy, because you get, well, what does that mean? How did the Lannisters cause it? What was happening immediately before, in the years before the doom? There were two things. Firstly, the Maesters seemed to be going there, collecting knowledge and going away again. Secondly, all of the noble families of Westeros were trying to buy Valyrian steel swords. Valyrian steel swords came from Valyria. This is where they were. But because of this prophecy, none of the Valyrians would sell a Valyrian steel sword to the Lannisters, because Lannisters were going to give them Lannister gold. So the Lannisters are looking for a Valyrian steel sword. They can't get a Valyrian steel sword because nobody's selling them a Valyrian steel sword. But we know that they get one eventually. We don't know how. Now, they could have got it by just taking over another house, but this doesn't seem to be, there's no hints to that. So who else has got the knowledge from old Valyria? The Maesters. So my theory is that they, with their Lannister gold, they bought the Valyrian steel sword from the Maesters. We know the Maesters know how to forge, and they've got lots of knowledge from old Valyria. We know that they forged the links, the Valyrian steel links, so they clearly got knowledge of how to do this. And so they suddenly have Lannister gold. What do they do with it? Now, it's a subject for an entire other video about what are the Maesters after, but I think it seems very clear to me that the Maesters are about scientific advance and actually trying to dampen down magic everywhere. What is at the time, what is the single biggest threat to that? That is Valyria. If they've got all the knowledge out of it they want, then they can get rid of Valyria. They've now got a mass of Lannister gold. Who can they pay to do that? The Faceless Men. So for me, that's how this all ties together, is that the Faceless Men basically admitted they did it. We just need to find out who had the funds to pay for it and who had the motive to do it. The people who had the motive were the Maesters. The people who may well have had the funds were the Maesters. And the gold that seemed was the cause of all of this sort of the prophecy was the Lannister gold, and that seems to have been the gold that did it. So that's my theory. I should probably say we don't know any of this, but it's just what makes most sense to me.
That's nice. That's actually one I haven't heard before, and I do like that. And it seems like most of the theories are in the fandom revolve around the sword, bright sword, the sword, bright roar, and and it's because it's just kind of put right out there, and it said the gold of Casterly Rock will bring about the doom, the fall of the Valyria. So, and so most of the theories that I have heard surround this, and the one that I like, and it's not actually my theory, it's one that I've heard and that I really like and appreciate, and I think that has a good standing for being correct. It originally the theory was that the Targaryens had desired to take over, to bring about the fall of Valyria and to kind of have all the dragons and gain all the power. And it's basically the same kind of premise where they would sell this they would sell a sword to the Lannisters, and then the Lannisters would go ahead and take, or excuse me, they would sell. Okay, so the sword would be sold to the Lannisters, and the Lannisters would give them the gold for that, and the gold would buy the Faceless Men, because the Faceless Men said that they helped bring about the fall of the Masters. So we know that the Faceless Men are involved. We know the cold of Casterly Rock is involved. And so you kind of put two and two together. And of course, the Targaryens are like what the only people to have survived. So who would have benefited the most would be obviously House Targaryen. And so people think that, oh, this whole Danish the Dreamer thing is just something that they made up as a cover in order to get to Dragonstone. However, there is a possibility that their daughter was just very, very, clairvoyant. Like she was just a very, very vivid dreamer. And the thing that to take home is that you don't sell all your family's property and move to another continent just because your daughter has a bad dream. And so if she was a dreamer, she probably was an incredibly prophetic dreamer. And it's seen throughout the Targaryen lineage that there are some very, very prophetic dreamers within the Targaryen dynasty. So, and she wrote a book called Signs and Portents. And so the Doom of Valyria probably didn't, encompass an entire book as far as her dreams go. So she probably was very prophetic in her dreams. But what people overlook, and this is something that someone on Twitter, and I believe it was either a person that goes by Blue Blood or Blue Tiger, I don't recall who it was, but it was someone on Twitter that pointed out that another survivor was a guy named Orion. He was Orion the Dragon Rider. And Orion, if you look at the name Orion, the root of the name is actually gold. It's AUR. So a guy named Gold had survived the Doom as well, and he also had a dragon. And not only did he have a dragon, and his name is Gold, and he survived the Doom, but he also declared himself Emperor of Valyria and tried to take back and conquer the entire continent. And so if he would have been successful, he would have been the one to have benefited from it the most. Unfortunately, something terrible befell him, and he didn't make it there, and his entire army didn't make it there. But if you kind of look at the clues actually point to Orion, the Dragon Rider, as well. So that's the theory that I like. And it kind of is just like an offshoot of a more, well-known theory that's been around in the fandom for quite some time. I think that it first started by a post by Lord Too Fat to Sit a Horse on Westeros.org. But yeah, it's there.
Well, I mean, I think there are many theories of this. I think what we seem to agree on is the fact that the Faceless Men actually did the deed, that what paid them was the Lannister gold. And the question, therefore, is who has the motive to do this?
Exactly.
So that for me is the crux of the matter now. The idea it has to be, therefore, that the Lannisters paid whoever it was who could give them their sword, and that money went to pay the Faceless Men. I don't want too much of to and fro on these, because I think that both of these ideas have got huge advantages and possibly disadvantages as well. As I say, my only reflection on the idea that the Targaryens benefited is the fact that actually the Targaryens who were there at that time did not benefit. The Targaryens moved to Dragonstone and stayed there for 100 years and didn't really do all that much. They didn't reconquer any parts of Essos. They didn't do anything for 100 years. So that, for me personally, that doesn't come across as a family who had this cunning plan to destroy all of Valyria and then sit on a small rock that doesn't quite add up. But as I say, there are many ideas out there, so I would highly recommend people go out, have an investigate, see what you think about it. Clearly, somebody did this, and it's a matter of who's got the motivation and who had that Lannister gold. But let's move on now to think about what happened in the aftermath. So after, if you think of this as kind of like a figurative Roman Empire, when the Roman Empire fell in Europe, there were what are called the Dark Ages, because basically, all of this civilization crumbled around and all of the learning went. There was this equivalent, really, in Essos, which is called the Century of Blood. What do you want to just very sort of, again, at sort of an overview level, what happened after we had the Doom of Valyria? We've talked about there being a couple of survivors, about people heading off back into Valyria, that not working. What happened next?
So the Dothraki, who are the barbarians, they took advantage of the opportunity. So the Dothraki horse lords, they stayed to the grassy plains, and they kind of shunned the forested areas, and they preferred to stay on the Dothraki Sea, which is like a type of a Great Plains if you're from the US. But anyway, I guess the Valyrians were somewhat providing protection to the other peoples that were around the area. So the main ones you're going to find are the Sarnori and the Ibbenese. And the Ibbenese, the Ibbenese, they do still exist. They're still there. And actually, there is one Sarnori city left as well, but their god king was thrown down for the Ibbenese. They did have a settlement that was here on the mainland, and they went ahead, the Dothraki, they took care of that, and the Ibbenese were no longer settled on, and established on the continent of Essos. And then they also went for the Sarnori, and the Sarnori were actually very well established throughout what is now the Dothraki Sea. They were very established. They had several cities. They were called the Tall Men, and they had lots of architecture and learning. They had one of their buildings was one of the the seven wonders made by man, or was it nine? I think it's 9 wonders made by man. It's just this a great established civilization, and the Dothraki were like, okay, so the Valyrians aren't here to protect you anymore, so we're going to go ahead and take advantage of that. And a lot of them were enslaved and sold to the people in Slavers Bay. And so the Dothraki, they took the land, and they also benefited by enslaving the people and selling them over to Slavers Bay. And so a lot of the slaves in Slavers Bay, the ones that are kind of they're established and bred and everything, are probably an admixture of a lot of people that were during the Century of Blood enslaved. So it's they just kind of went around and destroyed everything and took it for themselves.
Absolutely. So the empire, yeah. So the empire collapses. The big winners are the Dothraki, and just watching the show or reading the books, you don't necessarily get quite an idea about how massive now the Dothraki Sea is. They wiped out all of the middle of Essos. Civilizations fell before them. And what you're left with really are now cities around the outside of Essos. There are a couple in the middle, but mostly they're now around on the coasts. And you get what are called the free cities. These are cities, the exception being Bravos, but these are cities which once were under the rule and protection of old Valyria, but then they became free. So they each then carved out their own niche, and you get Volantis is probably the one to mention the most. They saw themselves as the heirs of old Valyria, and they, to a degree, have tried to keep up this idea of Volantis as being the successor city, and so they have a sort of an empire themselves. A lot of the towns that you hear Tyrion encountering as they're going down in the Shy Maid, or talking about down the River Royne, like Selhoris and places like that, these are actually cities, but they're just not allowed to be called cities because they're owned by Volantis. So Volantis was a big winner. The other big winner, as you say, the slaver cities, they kind of tried to recreate this idea of Old Geese, which was this ancient empire that the Valyrians defeated centuries before. And they then started up this massive slave trade. What, though, happened to Valyria itself? Big explosion. What is left now?
So the peninsula is fragmented right now, and Valyria itself, the city, is still there. It's now on an island in one of the many fragments. But the dragon roads that had connected the cities, half of them are submerged, and what's left in place of this, once great and fertile peninsula is now just a collection of fragmented islands, and which is surrounded by what we know now as the Smoking Sea. And it's said that the sea is a sea of acid-like boiling water. And it's not very habitable, as you could probably imagine. And it said that anybody who lays eyes on Valyria now, is doomed. So, and we don't have a lot of people that have been to Valyria that can tell the tale. We have one that boasts that he's been to Valyria and back, and that's Euron. But there's some that actually question whether he's actually been there or not, because the reader, when there's this little conversation between the two, the reader kind of questions it and he gets real mad. So it's possible he may be fibbing too. It's possible that we don't have anybody that's lived to tell the tale. There are some cities that are a little bit more to the north, closer to like Slaver's Bay, that is still there and it's still populated. One of them, the people are very misshapen and very monstrous. And so it's not what you would consider habitable now. But at one time it was one of the most fertile, beautiful places that you could be.
Yeah, and so let's talk about Euron. So we get a few different characters that we know who go there. Uncle Geryon, Tyrion's uncle Lannister, heads off there trying to find the sword that had been left there by a previous Lannister. That was Joffrey Lannister. Tom and Lannister. Yeah, Tom and Lannister, who'd been there before. Again, nobody had returned. You get lots of people who sort of head off there because they know that this was the center of everything. There are riches there, there is learning there, there is so much there, potentially, if only you could get there and come out. And we have one or possibly two examples of people going there and coming out.
Yes.
We'll talk about Aerea in a moment because you mentioned her earlier. Let's talk about Euron first. So Euron boasts that he has been there. The little encounter that you talk about when he says somebody challenges on him on it, and he basically says you should just stick to reading, which you could take two ways really. You could either, well, you clearly know nothing, I'm doing all the stuff, or you just stick to that, don't rile me up here. So Euron says that he's been there with his crew. His crew, he's cut all their tongues out so they can't say anything. And he seems to have merged with at least two Valyrian artifacts. He's got this horn called Dragonbinder, which does definitely seem to be magic. Whether it can bind dragons, we've yet to discover, but the person who blows it dies, his lungs turn to ashes and all the rest of it. And secondly, in one of the pre-release chapters from the Winds of Winter, he seems to have a suit of Valyrian steel armor, which is ridiculous. Do you think he could have got them from elsewhere, but do you think he did go there?
From what we know, we don't have any evidence to tell us that he hasn't. We're seeing artifacts that we haven't seen anywhere else, and we don't really know. We can speculate. Is it possible that those artifacts can be found in Asshai? We know he's gone to Asshai. Possible. We don't know that that's that would be available for there. It's just pure speculation. And so, from what we know, we have to kind of at least put some weight to it. It's only been speculated that people cannot go there and live. So he does have his Valyrian steel scale armor, and he does have dragon binder. And dragon, we have not seen any of those items anywhere else within the series. And the place you'd most likely find them is Valyria. And so, would it be any worse to just say he found it in Asshai? What good would it do what purpose would it serve, I guess, to say that he found it, to lie and say he found it in Valyria? Would he, I don't think that he's really getting that much more out of it by, if he was lying and just, and saying he went to Valyria. He could have told people he went to Asshai, and people would have still thought that was great because not a lot of people go to Asshai. So it's just one of those things that I don't have the answer, and I'm very curious. And I really want to see what actually happens, especially with that horn in the Winds of Winter. And there's some really good speculation with poor Quentin. He's on Twitter. He's got some really good theories. So yeah, I'm very excited.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on this one. This is one of those ones that we do not know. We haven't seen either of these. These things are not just slightly different. These things, if they are what they seem to be, are above and beyond what we've seen in the rest of the world to a stupid level. This is, if you can control a dragon with this horn, at the moment, not even Daenerys can control her dragon. Where we left it in the books is that Drogon flew her off deep into the Dothraki Sea, and she even, and I think foreshadowing, she thinks, oh, I'm sure I heard that the Valyrians used to have horns that could control their dragons. If only I had one of them. So clearly there's something going on there. It's very important. And the Valyrian steel suit of armor, the amount of steel in that, when you consider how expensive a Valyrian steel sword or dagger is, that this is, everything that a family could ever possibly want, even a family as rich as the Lannisters, once they lost theirs, they couldn't get another one back. This is huge. So these aren't just like nice little baubles. These are magnificent things. Euron is crazy enough to go there. That I'm pretty sure of. He could have gone there. That doesn't necessarily mean he had to go all the way in. Maybe he just went to the Valyrian Peninsula, picked up a few things and went away. We don't know, and we probably, frankly, never will know. But the person who we think probably did go there, this is the story in Fire and Blood of Aerea Targaryen. Now, I'll very briefly tell the story, and then if you could give your reflections on what you think happened, because I think this links into what you're talking about right at the beginning with all of the sort of the dragon blood and the worms, fireworms, and all the rest of it. So we get Aerea Targaryen. This is back in Fire and Blood, who is this princess, and she is desperate to go out and see the world and all the rest of it. She is technically the heir to the throne. It's all a bit complicated, but she gets onto Balerion the Black Dread, who is the biggest, most ancient, most amazing dragon anywhere since the Doom. And she obviously can't control him. he disappears off for a very long time, comes back with Aerea on his back, lands in King's Landing, and she, this is the closest George R. R. Martin in these books has got to pure horror. Her body underneath the skin is writhing with what appears to be, this is Septon Barth who discovers all of what appears to be fireworms living inside her. Even Balerion, who is just indomitable, has got this huge gash down his side. She obviously dies. Balerion sort of recovers but dies a little bit later anyway. We don't know where they went, but all the hints are that they went to old Valyria. What are your reflections on that story?
So I love reading the Aerea story, and I may be one of the only people, because a lot of people who've read it are incredibly grossed out by it. But I love reading the Aerea thing, and this instance is actually one of the things that really helped me to kind of figure out how Septon Barth was right, and how the Valyrians kind of fit into the equation of mixing the fireworm and the wyvern, because a lot of people, they take a look at the worms and they are completely focused on the worms themselves, and they're pretty right in doing so. I mean, it's really gross and it's really horrific and macabre, but I have a healthcare background, and so what I was really interested in is how Aerea's body was able to kind of acclimate to those worms that were described as creatures of heat and fire. And if you actually read, all of the torture that she had been put through, and how her skin had turned to pork cracklings, and she had blood in her eyes, and that Septon Barth had said that her skin was boiling to the touch, and he kept on going on about the heat that was being emitted from her. And one of the things that you should know already, it's not uncommon knowledge, is that our bodies can only take so much heat. However, George has actually spoken on an interview, and he has stated that Targaryens do have more heat tolerance. They're not fireproof. They do have more heat tolerance than the average person. And it wasn't until Fire and Blood that we really learned how much heat tolerance. And so what I quickly kind of came to understand is that humans were probably needed for dragon creation, kind of in a way like incubators. They serve kind of as hosts for the dragon magic involved in creating dragons. And so, and the worms did come out of Aerea, they were kind of like hybrids of sorts. They weren't just the worms. They were worms with faces, snakes with hands. And so you start to kind of put things together. And so I really like that. I do believe that she probably went to, it's going to be Valyria, possibly, I guess maybe Gogossos, but it's probably Valyria. So, and so Septon Barth probably was once again right, that all clues point to Valyria, and that's where she went. That's where she picked up whatever she picked up there, and it's great, and I love reading it. And I actually got an opportunity to read it not too long ago again, and it's something that sparks my curiosity just because of how her body was able to do that. So yeah,
I think this is the one or more of the big evidences, as you say, that the Targaryens as Valyrians are different. There's something there that is not just human. They've been spliced in some way with all of this kind of dragon blood. That's what it means. And we've got about 10 more minutes just to sort of chat through this. But I think what I'd like to do is to take all of this that we've learned and try and say, what does that mean for the story going forward? Because we've got the Targaryens are the last of these great dragon lords. We should probably be clear, there are lots, thousands, tens of thousands of people out there with bits of Valyrian heritage there. So if you go to Lys, then you'll find lots of people who look very Valyrian. If you go onto Dragonstone, then the Targaryens there, with all the villagers around there, the villagers treated them like gods, and the Targaryens made use of that. And so there are lots of children there. They were called the Dragon Seeds. We come across them when we get into the Dance of the Dragons. There are lots of illegitimate Targaryen Valyrian children out there. So I think, broadly speaking, we can sort of like leave them, all of that to one side, and focus in on the Targaryens. The Targaryens, as we now understand them, are not just humans. They're not just like a slightly different race. They are actually part dragon, quite literally. All of these words about, I am the dragon, and blood of the dragon, and all the rest of it, we actually have to take them to a degree literally. And that means that Daenerys and Jon, probably when we get to it, they have got in them a little bit of this dragon blood. What do you think that will mean? Particularly, let's start with Daenerys here. What will that mean for the plot? Because we know that she's being Quaithe is saying, "Remember who you are," and it's like, "I will take what is mine through fire and blood." Are we going to see a more dragony side to her come out? And what does that mean for the plot?
Okay, good. That's a great question. So, yes. Quaithe also said that she is going to have to light three fires. 3 fires you shall light. And we know that she's lit one. We know that she has lit the fire for Drogo's pyre. And that is described by George as being kind of like a miracle that happened. But in the show, we see Dany burning the coals. And that's probably going to be the second fire that she lights. And knowing that Targaryens do have an amount of heat tolerance could be kind of the difference between life and death in that kind of a situation. So it's interesting because there's a lot of readers that don't know this, but if you look at the dedication for the 3rd book, George R.R. Martin, when he had first developed this story, he had not originally wanted to have dragons. He had wanted the Targaryens to have almost like a type of pyrokinesis. And so that one of his friends had just, and used like dragons kind of as just their symbol. But one of his friends, was like, use dragons, they're cool. So he ended up doing it, and he dedicated his 3rd book to that friend who convinced him to put dragons into the series. So do I think that this heat tolerance, is probably going to possibly play a role in their just connection to dragons in general that other people do not have? Absolutely. They're blood of the dragon. And we see that. We've seen kind of how it could possibly go down as far as how the show interpreted it. Jon has blood of the dragon. He may ride a dragon. There aren't a lot of instances where people who do not have blood of the dragon can ride a dragon. The only instance where it's highly contested is the one with Nettles during the Dance of Dragons. But other than that, there's a good chance that you do have to have some sort of lineage or heritage in order to do that. And that's probably why incest was a thing, because there was only 40 dragon riding families, and they didn't want to create more dragon riding families. So they kind of kept it within the family. And that's kind of where that kind of plays into effect. So we'll see it. It could be the burning of the cows, and that, maybe that's it. Maybe we'll see Jon riding a dragon. Maybe we'll see some sort of heat tolerance playing into the story a little bit more. But we do know that the Valyrians do have this type of heat tolerance, and we see that in a few instances, and we're probably going to see some more. So be looking out for it.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with that. I think you're absolutely right with Daenerys with the fires. The way I look at this is to say that she lights lots of fires, but most of the time it's through her dragons. And it's the times when she herself lights fires. Those are the times we need to look for. So the first one was with Khal Drogo. The second one, I think, I agree, will be with the Khals. The third, I do wonder. This is a time for a completely different video, but if she herself will light a fire with her body, with a sword being plunged into her in this kind of Nisa way, and the sword comes out fiery. There are bits of hints of that all over the place, but so I'm just going to leave that there rather than unpack that too much, because that's quite a big subject. But I think the thing with Jon here is going to be fascinating, because Jon is half Targaryen. Therefore, his imagery is not just about dragons and fire and all the rest of it. It's the combination of fire and ice. So that's where he kind of fits in with this. So Dany is going to be very much this kind of fire symbolism, and he's going to be this sort of mix of fire and ice. I think I'm going to sort of bring this one largely to a close now. Is there anything else that you think we desperately need to be thinking about when we're thinking about old Valyria and what the implications of all of this might be for the story going ahead?
One thing that I do want to kind of put out there, and it's something that I discussed in part 2, is when I did my Dragon Origins videos. In part 2, so we know that Septon Barth was probably right, and that dragons were created through the crossing of a couple animals, probably the wyvern and the fireworm. And so we know that occurred. So we know this to be true. However, there's evidence, architectural evidence in both Old Town and beyond the Five Forts to suggest that dragons were around prior to the Valyrian freehold. And we know it was there. It's, maybe they use a fireworm. There's been speculation about wildfire, being able to create that. But chances are there were dragons there. And so in part 2, what I did is I discussed how the Great Empire of the Dawn and Valyria are most likely related, and how we would come to find out in part 2 that it was most likely the people that were creating dragons were not the Valyrians themselves, but the precursors to the Valyrian Empire. And that would be the Great Empire of the Dawn. And so, so if you take a look at the other information in the other dragon origin stories, where it said that the people of Ashai had taught, had dragons and had taught the Valyrians their arts, it starts to make sense in a number of ways, because Valyria was most likely a precursor to the, the Great Empire of the Dawn was most likely a precursor to the Valyrian civilization. And so the thing that I do want people to understand, if you watch both videos, is that it wasn't necessarily the Valyrians who had done that, but it was most likely a precursor. But it's very fuzzy as far as, where does this civilization start and end? It's very, very fuzzy, and they're kind of, they kind of mesh together in very different ways. And the confusion is seen throughout Westeros, and is seen throughout like the maesters and everything. So, so that does get kind of fuzzy, but what I do is I just kind of spell everything out in part 2. So when we take a look at who, specifically created the dragons, it was most likely a Valyrian precursor. But that's the only other thing that I think that people should take home, is to not only watch part 1, but also watch part 2, because a lot of unanswered questions that the fandom is always asking, and always, it's always very, very confusing, is if Valyrians did this, then what about the fused stone fortress, on Battle Isle? What about the Five Forts? Well, that gets answered as well. So, that's the only thing that I would definitely want to kind of clarify, is that it wasn't necessarily the Valyrians, but it was probably a Valyrian precursor that the Valyrian civilization sprung out from. And so,
I think that's a fantastic way to end this. Is to say this goes back pretty much to the dawn of time as we understand it. The Great Empire of the Dawn is one of those absolutely ancient empires. We get Asshai with its great knowledge, which is where you go to if you're wanting this huge esoteric knowledge, even more than where Valyria was. Asshai now is the place where all of this ancient knowledge comes from. And of course, that's where Melisandre learned a lot of her magic and all the rest of it. Melisandre of Asshai, and she gets this, and the link across to Daenerys is going to be very, very strong. I'm going to round this one up now. Amanda, thank you so much for coming on. This is an absolute pleasure and delight, as it always is. Do you want to just let people know? I'm going to put a link down in the description to the videos that you're mentioning, but do you want to just let people know where they can find you on the internet?
Okay, so if you're looking for the videos that we were discussing today, it is on my channel. I'm not really doing videos right now. Maybe I will when I'm bored. But it's called The Disputed Lands, and you can find them there. So otherwise, you can find me on Twitter at crowfood_SD.
Excellent. I would highly recommend that you do go and check out all of those things. Okay, I'm going to make you disappear for just 1 second, Amanda, just so that I can do my little pointing in the air. So, guys, if you enjoyed this video, you want the rest in this series, we've had one on Winterfell. We're going to be looking at other secrets of the world, Ice and Fire. Then appearing about here is going to be a link to those other videos, and appearing here-ish is a link to my Patreon page if you want to support the channel, or if you want to get access to some stuff I do just for my patrons. Thanks a lot again, Amanda, for coming on. It's been an absolute delight. Take care, everyone, and I will see you next time.